They believed they knew every threat the Americans could put in the air. Many Luftwaffe pilots, veterans of combats against the RAF and dive attacks on Soviet columns, thought they had seen it all. Heavy flak, 7.92mm machine guns, some 20mm automatic cannons. None of that really scared them. But upon arriving at the Western Front, they discovered something they didn't expect. A weapon that didn't even seem to make sense. Too big to be a common machine gun, too small to be a cannon. A weapon that spat out projectiles so fast and so heavy that they altered the very behavior of the enemy fuselage. It was the Browning M2.5, a caliber that, at first glance, shouldn't decide a war, but ended up becoming one of the most feared symbols of the Allied arsenal. And that fear wasn't born from propaganda or later exaggeration. It began on the battlefield, in real encounters, reported by pilots who returned to base trembling. Some described the 50 tracer bullets as Stumpen aus Feuer, cigars of fire, rising toward them in almost solid lines. Others told stories of dives that always worked against Soviet columns, but now ended in such abrupt damage that they seemed like cannon hits. None of this made sense to those accustomed to 7.92mm machine guns or even 20mm MG151 cannons. The feeling was that something invisible was coordinating the American fire. But the detail that really started to bother the Germans wasn't the brute power of the 50 BMG projectile, although it was scary in itself. It was the regularity, the repetition, the logic. The impacts always came from the same angles, the same distances, the same sectors, as if each shot had been anticipated minutes before the attack happened. It wasn't just force, it was a pattern. And that pattern started to generate murmurs in German pilot briefings. Some officers said the Americans were using new types of explosive ammunition. Others suspected onboard radar. And some simply called it deadly mathematics. Behind the Browning M2, there was something they still couldn't see. An idea. A combat philosophy that was beginning to transform the European sky into forbidden territory. Stay with me until the end, because the secret that really ignited the Luftwaffe's hatred wasn't the weapon itself. It was the hidden method that turned every 50 into a piece of an invisible map of destruction. Because what the Germans started reporting in the following days was so improbable, so repeated, and so frightening that the high command thought it was exaggeration, until they saw the wreckage. The real origin of this fear didn't appear all at once, but in dozens of encounters that began to repeat like a recurring nightmare. During attacks against American armored columns in Normandy and against support ships in the Mediterranean, Luftwaffe pilots noticed something strange. Approaches that were once almost routine, a quick dive, a precise shot, and exit to the side, were turning into true corridors of fire. An Oberleutnant from JG-26 recorded in his report that the bursts seemed to come from different weapons, but all followed the same line. This caught the attention of the high command. The phenomenon causing this astonishment wasn't a new secret projectile, as some feared, but a brutal combination of real factors. The .50 BMG ammunition traveled at very high speeds, with enough energy to rip out entire sections of thin fuselage sheets. And the M2 platform was so stable that it allowed long, straight bursts without excessive dispersion. For a pilot attacking at low altitude, that meant that a half-second error could result in a fatal impact. But there was a second element, the one that really started to shake German confidence. Many reports mentioned that the shots seemed to anticipate the trajectory. When a German fighter made an evasive turn to the right, the tracers were already there. When it dived, the burst followed. It wasn't magic, it was mathematics, but not yet understood by those on the front line. Some pilots began to suspect tactical ground radar. Others suggested that the Americans had developed a prediction model based on the Luftwaffe's usual attack tactics, which in practice wasn't entirely wrong. The truth is that the Americans were learning fast. Every destroyed column, every hit aircraft fed reports on the most common Luftwaffe approach angles, average attack speeds, frequently exploited blind spots. Every small piece of information was transformed into smarter machine gun positioning. And that's when German perception began to change. They weren't just facing precise shots. They were facing repeated patterns, predictable trajectories, impact zones that always appeared in the same places, whether on a Normandy beach or a muddy road in Belgium. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance. It was a system that was beginning to take shape, and the Germans were entering it without realizing. What no one suspected yet was that this American adaptation was about to take a gigantic leap. And that leap would create the doctrine that would transform the 50 into something much bigger than a machine gun. The doctrine that would shape the destiny of the M2 didn't come from a single military genius, but from an entire generation of strategists pressured by growing losses. Among them, one name stood out for the almost clinical coldness with which he analyzed the chaos: Curtis LeMay. He didn't believe in heroic improvisation or chivalrous air duels. For him, air war was pure statistics, probability, geometry. And that transformed the Browning 50 into much more than armament. It transformed it into a tool within a calculation. LeMay and other analysts began to notice something simple but devastating. German attacks, although aggressive, were not unpredictable. The Luftwaffe relied on three tactical pillars: high-speed frontal attacks, low-level dives against ground targets, and oblique approaches from the rear. This worked perfectly against more dispersed Soviet or British formations, but the Americans began to map these patterns. Every reconnaissance mission, every hit column, every bomber turned into scrap provided new data. Instead of placing machine guns where they fit, as many countries did at the beginning of the war, the Americans began to position M2s based on the statistically most likely angles of German attack. In practice, this meant that, without realizing, enemy fighters were flying right into the firing lines where the 50 was most lethal. And this organization began to repeat. In North Africa, a JG-27 pilot reported that while performing a dive over an American column, he felt as if the ground was spitting fire, exactly where I would be. Months later, in Italy, different pilots reported the same behavior. Concentrated bursts, always in specific sectors, always in the same type of approach. That couldn't be coincidence, and it wasn't. But the truly transformative leap came when LeMay applied this logic not just to the ground, but to the sky. He realized that if M2s could create horizontal denial zones against ground attacks, they could also create vertical layers of protection when installed on bombers. It was a counterintuitive idea, using a heavy bomber not just to destroy targets, but to soak the entire sky with interlocking defensive arcs. That thinking gave rise to something that would change the entire German perception of air combat. And if on the ground the Germans already had difficulty interpreting this pattern, in the air they would find a barrier that bordered on the impossible, forming something that no German pilot could cross unscathed. When LeMay took his logic to the skies, air war changed forever. The solution wasn't to increase the caliber of weapons or multiply heavy cannons, it was to reorganize what already existed. The result of this cold and mathematical vision was the formation that would become a symbol of American aviation in Europe, the combat box. At first glance, it seemed like just a group of B-17s flying close together, but seen by those attacking, it was a floating wall. The idea was incredibly simple and, at the same time, bold. Each bomber had between 10 and 13 Browning 50 machine guns, covering practically all quadrants. Alone, a B-17 was vulnerable, but when placed in staggered formation, some higher, others lower, others slightly offset, the fields of fire overlapped. What was an isolated plane became an interlocking defensive structure with angles that reinforced each other. For a German pilot, attacking that required courage or desperation. A JG-3 veteran described the sensation. It was like diving into a whirlwind of bullets. You chose a point to attack, but all the weapons seemed pointed at you. That perception wasn't exaggeration. In tests and real missions, American gunners reported that it took only a few seconds to turn a frontal approach into a rain of tracers. Many gunners trained the so-called wall of fire, firing short and alternating bursts, creating a continuous strip of projectiles. For the Luftwaffe, it was like trying to cross a portal made of incandescent metal. Meanwhile, on the ground, another piece strengthened this doctrine: the M45 Quadmount, a rotating turret with 4 M2s aligned side by side. Producing up to 2,000 rounds per minute, it was capable of saturating the low sky with an intensity that no German fighter could ignore. Although not as omnipresent as the combat box, the Quadmount reinforced a growing idea. The M2 wasn't just armament, it was the center of a defensive ecosystem. The German shock didn't come just from seeing these systems operating, but from realizing they weren't isolated initiatives. At sea, on the ground, and in the air, a pattern emerged: density, overlap, and anticipation. The Luftwaffe wasn't facing American weapons, it was facing an American philosophy, a way of thinking that treated the sky like a chessboard where every enemy move had a pre-calculated response. And that board would be put to the test in one of the bloodiest missions of the war, a mission that would be etched in the memory of all who survived. And it's in it that the true impact of this doctrine appears for the first time. The decisive proof of this doctrine came on August 17, 1943, in the double attack known as Schweinfurt-Regensburg. It was a bold and risky operation. Hundreds of B-17s would fly in broad daylight, without long-range escort, to attack critical ball-bearing factories and deep industrial installations in Germany. For the Luftwaffe, that was a golden opportunity, perhaps the greatest since the start of the air war against the Americans. The Germans prepared for a massacre. Entire groups of FW-190s and BF-109s were launched in waves, coordinated to attack from the front, from above, and from the tail. The tactics were known and sharpened: high-speed frontal attacks to hit the cockpit, and superior attacks to exploit the B-17's most vulnerable points. On paper, the Luftwaffe had every reason to win. But when the first formations approached the combat box, they found a hell they didn't expect. The combat box that day was more disciplined than ever. Gunners trained in short bursts, operators newly instructed to maintain cadence, and a collective awareness of flying without escort. With every frontal attack, dozens of 50s aligned as if breathing together. Every German dive met crossfire bursts from above, below, and the flanks. A JG-11 pilot wrote after the war, "I pointed my nose at the formation and only saw red lines coming toward me. There was no choosing a target. It was survive or die." The Americans suffered terrible losses: 60 bombers shot down in a single day, dozens damaged. For every B-17 crew, that flight was hours of Russian roulette. But for the Germans, the psychological impact was different. They shot down many bombers, yes, but they couldn't break the formation, disperse the attack, or prevent the bombing. It was like fighting a wall that always reformed itself. What shook the Luftwaffe the most was discovering that even with huge losses, the combat box remained functional. Even wounded, it kept shooting. Even reduced, it remained deadly. And German fighters paid too high a price for every approach. Schweinfurt-Regensburg was marked as a German tactical victory, but a slow, strategic defeat. They realized that attacking American daytime formations wasn't sustainable. Even winning, they lost too many pilots, especially the experienced ones, and replacement was impossible at that point in the war. It was there that the embryo of true hatred was born, not against the weapon, not against the plane, but against the strategy that turned every B-17 into part of a living fortress. And that resentment would only grow when the Americans refined that system to make it even more relentless. If the doctrine worked on paper, executing it in the sky was another story. The combat box didn't survive by magic. It survived because hundreds of men, spread across dozens of B-17s, operated as if they were a single machine. And that required something that doesn't appear in tactical manuals: relentless logistics and almost superhuman discipline. The M2 machine guns had a legendary reputation for reliability, but that didn't mean they withstood any abuse. A burst too long, and the barrel heated up to the point of turning red. Ammunition needed to be fed without failures, belts checked, and internal parts required constant cleaning. On the ground, entire teams worked non-stop to keep every weapon ready for the next flight. In the air, the pressure was brutal. Changing an overheated barrel at 7,000 meters with the plane vibrating under attack required steady hands and cold nerves. But the bigger challenge was human. LeMay's doctrine depended on something extremely difficult: emotional control. The M2 had a fire rate sufficient to burn through ammunition quickly, and inexperienced gunners, driven by fear, had the natural impulse to keep their finger on the trigger when seeing a German fighter approaching. That was fatal for the entire formation. So, gunner training changed. They were no longer just taught to shoot at the enemy, but to think like operators of a system. They learned to identify probable trajectories, anticipate angles, fire only when the enemy was really in the ideal sector. Short, precise, coordinated bursts. No chaos, no desperation. A veteran gunner once recounted that during a frontal attack, his instinct told him to pull the trigger immediately, but he waited 3 seconds, exactly as he had trained. In that short interval, the Bf-109 entered the perfect sector. A single burst was enough. It wasn't courage, he recalled later, it was discipline. That discipline spread via radio, through the cockpit, in the cramped bunks of airbases. It was what kept men awake studying tactical charts. It was what prevented panic when a neighboring bomber exploded. It was what made every gunner believe the combat box only existed because he did his part in the exact second needed. The Luftwaffe expected to find disorganization, windows of error, chaos, the very fuel for their aggressive tactics. Instead, they found something unexpected: a human wall, as solid as the steel of the M2s. And that wall would be tested in one of the riskiest moments of the entire air campaign, when American strategists prepared an even bolder response to German persistence. The Luftwaffe wasn't naive. After months facing increasingly disciplined formations, their analysts began studying the combat box with the same coldness LeMay had applied months earlier. German reports began mapping the most dangerous firing sectors, the least protected quadrants, the average response time of gunners, and even the firing routines that repeated between different bomber groups. For them, there was a pattern, and where there's a pattern, there's a flaw. Eventually, they believed they had found one: a narrow corridor that emerged between two bomber groups when they maneuvered for repositioning. It wasn't a huge hole, but it seemed like a point where the defensive arcs crossed late. In theory, a coordinated and quick attack could cross it before the gunners adjusted the angle. The analysis made sense, on paper. Convinced they had deciphered the Achilles heel of the combat box, commanders assigned experienced pilots, some with dozens of victories, to test the breach. The idea was simple: enter fast, attack the heart of the formation, and exit before the 50s reacted. But there was a detail they didn't know. The Americans had been observing that same trend for weeks. Crews noticed that German attacks began converging always through the same sector when the formation was repositioning. It was instinct. If there's a momentary micro-disorganization, even the most disciplined pilot tries to exploit it. Veteran gunners realized that this breach was always the first point chosen by the fighters. The American response wasn't to create a millimetrically calculated trap. That would be invention. What happened was more organic, more human, and, paradoxically, more lethal. They prepared for it. Gunners in the higher bombers adjusted their cadence to cover the flank that seemed vulnerable. Lateral crews began training crossfire bursts, creating a momentary lock when the attack came from that specific sector. It was a collective reflex, not a secret trick. When the confident German fighters dove through that breach, they found not a blind spot, but a sector reinforced by human anticipation. What should have been an advantage became a prison. When trying to climb, they entered the upper sectors. When trying to descend, they crossed bursts from lateral bombers. And when trying to retreat, they faced the firing concentration they intended to avoid. There was no radar, no bait. There was only adaptation, the essence of the American doctrine. For the Germans, that was devastating. The flaw in the combat box wasn't a flaw. It was just a temporary space that, like everything in that war, closed too quickly. The Luftwaffe realized there that they weren't facing just machines, but a living formation that learned. And from that moment, fear stopped being tactical and became psychological, something that would change the course of the next battles. The consequences of that tactical shock were much deeper than the reports suggested. It wasn't just the loss of aircraft. It wasn't just the fall of experienced aces. What really began to corrode the heart of the Luftwaffe was something harder to measure: hesitation. A silent psychological wear that turned aggressive pilots into overly cautious men, a luxury Germany couldn't afford. After successive encounters with increasingly disciplined American formations, some German commanders began noticing a worrying pattern. What was once coordinated and fierce attack began turning into timid approaches, shots at greater distances, and quicker withdrawals. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival calculation. Every combat showed that for every bomber shot down, an unsustainable number of German fighters didn't return. And at that phase of the war, experienced pilots were as valuable a resource as fuel, and both were disappearing. Internal reports from late 1943 and early 1944 clearly show this change. A JG-1 officer described it this way: "The enemy formation isn't a target, it's a wall. Whoever enters commits almost conscious suicide." That perception altered the very way the Luftwaffe organized its attacks. What was once direct offensive turned into attempts at attrition from long distances, Mk-108 cannon shots from frontal approaches too fast to be precise. But that enormously reduced effectiveness. Attacking from afar decreased risk, but also decreased chances of downing bombers. Meanwhile, on the American side, the dynamic changed in the opposite direction. The more the Luftwaffe hesitated, the more crews felt confident. Combat boxes, once seen as a fragile temporary solution, began to be regarded as mobile walls. Every mission reinforced the feeling that the system worked, even paying a high price for it. And there was another devastating side effect. With the reduction of direct German attacks, more bombers reached their targets. The impact on factories, railroads, and production centers began to accumulate. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing pilots, it was losing the ability to prevent the American industrial machine from crushing German infrastructure. Thus, the M2 and the doctrine that sustained it stopped being just defensive tools. They became indirect strategic weapons, affecting the entire German supply chain. They weren't just defending planes, they were destroying the German war effort from the inside out. The Luftwaffe would still try to resist. It would still launch desperate attacks. But at that point, something essential had already been broken: confidence. And it's that emotional, not just operational, collapse that would explain the lasting legacy of the M2 in the following years. When the war ended and the world began counting its dead, settling scores, and rebuilding cities, a curious truth emerged from testimonies on both sides. The M2 hadn't been just a weapon, it had been a symbol. For the Americans, it represented confidence in something that worked regardless of conditions: rain, snow, mud, high altitude, desert sand. The M2 was predictable when nothing else was. John Browning's shaggy and noisy machine always did exactly what was expected of it. For the pilots and gunners who survived the war, it was the sum of everything that had kept their bombers in the air. Discipline, training, camaraderie, cold mathematics, and an absurd amount of human courage compressed into every trigger pulled at the right moment. The M2 wasn't glamour, it was duty. On the German side, the meaning was inverse, but equally powerful. Many Luftwaffe veterans remembered the .5 not as a machine, but as a limit, the point where individual skill stopped mattering. The moment when the sky stopped being a space of maneuver and turned into a labyrinth of predictable, calculated, and deadly fire arcs. For them, the Browning was the bitter reminder that they were fighting against an industrial and strategic force greater than any individual bravery could overcome. And the most impressive thing is that the M2's legacy didn't end in 1945. The same weapon, with small improvements but the same mechanical heart, crossed the skies of Korea, swept valleys in Vietnam, defended bases in the Middle East, and to this day is present in vehicles, helicopters, and ships around the world. In a century of military evolution, few weapons have survived like it. Most were replaced, surpassed, forgotten. The M2 remained. Why? Because its true power was never just in the .50 caliber. It was in the logic that was born around it. The idea that a simple, reliable weapon used intelligently can become part of a defense network so efficient that it changes the enemy's behavior. The .50 didn't defeat the Luftwaffe alone, and it was never a superpower. What it did was integrate into a doctrine that turned ordinary bombers into fortresses and ordinary operators into human walls. In the end, the greatest tribute to the M2 didn't come from the Allies who fired it, but from the adversaries who learned to fear it. The German hatred, born of frustration and human cost, ended up becoming the involuntary confirmation of its effectiveness. And when we look at that legacy, we realize the final truth. The M2 wasn't just a weapon of World War II, it was an entire chapter of it. And if you want to continue exploring these hidden stories, forgotten narratives, and the tactical behind the scenes that changed the war, subscribe to the channel now. It costs nothing, helps a lot, and ensures you don't miss the next chapter of these stories that almost no one tells, but every history lover deserves to know.